Estás escuchando Radio Primavera Sound, proudly presented by Cupra.
And welcome back to Radio Primavera Sound. We are here with an author, Liz Pelly, whose book, Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist, has really been everywhere this year. Why do you think it's captured attention so much? I mean, beyond being a good book, but why do you think people are taking such an interest?
Mm-hmm. Something that I feel like, not just since the book came out, I started writing about Spotify in 2017, and I've wrote a series of essays and articles for different magazines and publications that were the foundation for the book. And, I can't exactly capture why maybe it has struck a chord in 2025, but over the years, something I've heard from people is that it's helpful to have some language that articulates, something that they deep down sort of felt was wrong about the way that we consume music and support music, and that it's helpful to have some language around it. I also think that, there's been a lot of really great reporting on the streaming economy over the years, but I'm not sure if there's been one instance of this much research in terms of not just interviews with people who work in the music business, but interviews with artists. And then I also managed to get a number of former Spotify employees and former streaming company employees to speak with me. So yeah, I think it's the combination of the reporting and maybe also the artist perspectives being central to it that has resonated with people.
Fundamentally, what is it that interests you in this subject? Mm-hmm. To spend 2 years on or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even longer, right? Because I started writing about Spotify in 2017, and I started working on the book proposal in 2019, and then working on the book in 2022. And just as someone for whom music is the social fabric of my life, I've been immersed in independent and DIY music communities since I was a teenager. It's, to me, music isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold and traded. It is something that is really fundamentally social and connects people. It's it's a necessary part of life. So I've always been interested in independent music and interrogating the centers of power in music and culture. And when I first started writing about streaming in the mid-2010s, it became really clear that if the idea of independent music or the idea of engaging with music in a way that interrogates power is to hold up in the platform era, that also needs to involve reckoning with tech companies. And not just Spotify, by the way, too. I mean, I've also written extensively about Amazon Music and Amazon and the horrific impact that Amazon has had on the music business through Amazon Music and through its impact on retail, through its festivals, through the way that it's normalized surveillance in the home through music, how it's used music to soften an image of an extremely extractive and exploitative company, one of the most exploitative employers in the entire world. So certainly Apple, Amazon, Google, these companies also aren't, immune to the criticisms made against Spotify in this book too.
In fact, I was. You have mentioned that, of course, for you, music is not a commodity. But one of the things that pops up in a more evident way is how on streaming platforms, this is what has happened. That music has just become a commodity that for at least a vast majority of users. This is what must struck to me, because since I do not feel that's how I use the streaming platforms, or maybe I do sometimes, but not mostly. But this idea of that a huge percentage of the users, they use it as a commodity in such a passive way, for me has been one of the great surprises of your book, how you bluntly reflect it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so hard to, actually make really big statements or generalizations about how all people listen to music or how most people use streaming. I think in some ways what the book highlights or puts forward is the ambitions of streaming companies, the ways in which it would be most profitable to them if people engaged with music. And these are private companies that have no interest or obligation to pursue anything other than whatever returns the most value to them and their shareholders. So they're obviously always going to like work in the interests of their corporate bottom lines, which, you know, in the case of Spotify is trying to get people to have as passive a relationship with music as possible so that they can point you in the direction of content. And I hate using the word content because it's not at all how I think about music. But they use this word, you know, they can push you towards content that is the cheapest for them to serve you. And I think there's so many implications of that for, you know, now the era of generative AI music flooding streaming services. There's, I think, going to be like a lot of sort of ways in which the subject matter discussed in this book kind of applies to that whole landscape too.
And sorry, then go ahead.
Oh no, just one thing that really interests me about this. I know a few people who work for Spotify. And a lot of them are, genuine music fans. They love music. And I think up to maybe 5 years ago, that I think Spotify as a company was kind of seen as quite a good thing. You know, you'd kind of tell people on a more general level.
As a music savior, also you reflect that when suddenly, well, not suddenly, but after the big crisis after the piracy at the beginning, Spotify was seen as a kind of a savior of music. You reflect that on your book.
I suppose what I was trying to get at, how do these people, how do people at Spotify who are music lovers, how do they feel about this?
Well, just to respond to the initial thought too, definitely one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book or wanted to investigate this subject at first was specifically to try to contribute to debunking that narrative, right? Like, certainly there are some entities for whom streaming has been a savior, which would be the global recorded music business. You can't deny that streaming returns the global recorded music business to profit after the impact of file sharing. But one of the questions that I ask really early on in the book is, is saving the global recorded music business the same thing as saving musicians or saving music, especially when you look at where the revenue from streaming goes. It's true that streaming services pass 70% of their revenue along to rights holders, but the reality is that most of that revenue goes to Sony, Universal, and Warner, not to independent musicians. In the course of, this interview, major labels will have made close to $1 million from streaming. They're making millions of dollars per hour. If you talk to any independent artist, and probably a lot of the artists on, I did actually interviews yesterday for, a story I'm working on in the press area with a bunch of musicians, and I was asking them, what percentage of your living expenses can you cover from streaming? And two of the artists on the bill for this festival said, 0. It's not even a question. It's none. We pay none of our living expenses through streaming. And I think that's something that people know streaming is not great for independent musicians, but I think it's important to realize it really is that stark. Some artists make literally nothing.
Are we talking mid-level artists? What kind of...
Yeah, not like the headliners. But even I talked to, some musicians yesterday who were on some of the bigger stages, and I asked, do you know what percentage of your living expenses you can pay from streaming? And they said, probably some, but I wouldn't be able to give you a hard number for that question. I'm not actually sure the exact percentage. And I think that is something that uniquely demonstrates, musicians have lots of different employers, lots of different revenue sources from which they cobble together a living in the streaming era. But recorded music, you should be able to know how much of your living expenses as a musician you're able to cover through the monetization of your recordings. Recorded music being, one of the biggest revenue streams for musicians.
Also, you explain in the book very well this process of how first the platform used users to listen music through playlists, and then when they were addicted to this playlist that turns them into passive listeners, then start changing artists for this perfect fit content, PFC, that I'm sure that you're going to explain better than me what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from the very beginning of reporting on the streaming economy on Spotify, my first article came out in 2017, and really quickly, someone who worked in the music business wrote me an email and said, great article, but what you should really be covering is this phenomenon of fake artists on Spotify. So this is something that people in the music industry had been talking about back to 2016, 2017, and what it was that a lot of people were noticing on their instrumental lean-back playlists, like music for studying, music for sleeping, chilling. There were all of these tracks that seemed to be by musicians that didn't exist. So there's other journalists have looked into it over the years. There's been some really good reporting from the Swedish tech press, but I was able to kind of like lift the veil further on the story, and at least in the case of Spotify, report and uncover that there's actually like an internal program at Spotify that sort of manages these types of playlists and the incorporation of this type of material.
One thing that really impressed me on a journalistic level is Spotify is a very big company. It has a lot of money, and I'm guessing it's got very good lawyers. But as far as I can see, you've had no blowback on the book, no nothing, right?
I haven't heard from anyone.
How did you get it so watertight, so correct? Was it just lots of sources, or?
Well, I interviewed over 100 people for the book. I also, the book draws upon review of internal documents, internal conversations. So yeah, I think the combination of sourcing and a lot of the things that I write about are things that like kind of had been discussed in the music industry for years, sort of like open secrets in the music business. And I was just like, trying to create a useful resource for musicians, for advocates, for artists, and but I still have questions. I certainly don't feel that it is like I was able to answer every single question that I had about streaming. Particularly one type of document that I have not been able to review is a contract. Streaming services strike these licensing deals with rights holders, with the major record labels that have enormous influence over how artists are paid, over how these services operate. And they're completely secret. They're protected by NDAs. Very few people have ever seen them. And it's really interesting. Most musicians will never get to review the contract that dictates the conditions of their work, essentially, how they're paid, because musicians aren't allowed to read these things.
And do you think you haven't seen one because there's something not good in it? Or to use a very kind of basic term, or is it just because they're NDAs, they're kind of secret, then you're not...
There's a lot of secrecy in the music business, and that's definitely like the big challenge of doing anything, getting close to investigative journalism around music. Is just like so much secrecy, so many NDAs. But I am also, like I mentioned earlier, a really big believer that you can tell really important stories about the music business by talking to musicians. I sort of think of it as like a pro-labor way of doing music business reporting. I recently went to go hear this labor journalist give a lecture, and he was talking about how, many, many years ago, newspapers used to have labor pages where they would cover like unions and the labor movement. And they'd also have a business page, and how the labor page was like the business page told from the perspective of the workers. And at least in the United States, you never see anything like that anymore. The concept of a labor page. And it really clarified for me, because I always wonder, why does the music business press not talk to musicians? Like, why are musicians' voices almost never incorporated into articles reporting on the impacts of the major moves of major labels and live music corporations, and reporting on the festival industry and streaming? And I think it's because most music business outlets are pro-business, like not pro-labor.
We're going to have to end, but I just wanted to ask one final question. I initially knew you as a journalist writing about music rather than music business. Obviously the two things are the same. Do you ever sort of want to go back to that? Or do you still kind of do it and just, get away from the mechanics and,
Yeah, I definitely, also love to write about a record, love to interview a band. If anyone's listening and wants to hire me to do any of those things, feel free to contact me. But yeah, I do feel like a, certain sense of urgency around reporting on industry issues too. So I'll definitely be continuing to do that in the coming months.
Liz, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. May it continue to rule the zeitgeist for many years. Why not?
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Estás escuchando Radio Primavera Sound, proudly presented by Cupra.